Hello and welcome to Wealth Matters, where we discuss the opportunities and challenges of preserving and managing wealth. This show is presented to you by Gaslowitz Frankel, a law firm dedicated to resolving disputes involving your wealth, whether through your will, your trust, your business, or your investments. For news, pictures, and tips, go to our new website at gaslowitzfrankel.com or follow us on Twitter at Estate Dispute. Our show's hashtag is Wealth Matters. Your hosts are Robert Port and Adam Gaslowitz, and today we're talking about the benefits of using a corporate fiduciary.
And now it's time to introduce our guests. We're pleased to have with us today Karen Havey, Family Wealth Strategist at BNY Mellon, and Tim Sheehan, Senior Director of Business Development at BNY Mellon. And before we get started, Tim, why don't you just give us a little background on what you and Karen do?
Well, Robert and Adam, thanks so much for having us this morning. It's always great. I'm a big avid follower of Wealth Matters, and I was excited that we're going to be talking about corporate fiduciaries, which are close to our home. Part of my role at BNY Mellon is to curate the resources of the firm. You know, we're the oldest fiduciary. We settled and administered the very first trust in the United States when Aaron Burr shot Alexander Hamilton.
I did not know that.
So you've got them in the house today.
Whose trust was that, Burr's or Hamilton's?
It was Hamilton's, and we've got a copy of it. We administered it.
Does that come with any tickets to the show?
Unfortunately not. I think the only thing we were able to do is do a couple of previews here. Alex Horowitz, we can get you in touch with, who was a roommate for Lin-Manuel. But beyond that,
we'll talk after the show.
That's our connection. Part of my role is to make sure that when individuals, families, foundations are looking for a solution for their wealth management needs, starting in with me, and I curate the resources of the firm. Oftentimes, they're looking for a fiduciary, but they're also looking for other services as well. That would include banking and investment services, maybe escrow services. And that's my role, just to make sure I work with the family, that they have access to the resources that the firm, so they can make a good decision about what's right for their family and their needs.
All right. And Karen?
Thank you. Yes, I work with our clients to help them figure out the best plan to actually preserve their wealth and to pass it down to their family in a way that they think is appropriate, which can be much more difficult than one might think. And it involves a lot of thought, and it's not just the technical aspects of it, but it's really getting to know our clients and getting to know their children and making sure that we have a full understanding of what would be in the best interest of everybody, and to just make sure that the wealth is going to be passed down in a way that's going to benefit the family as opposed to harming it.
Okay.
So let's start sort of very simply. A word we're going to use repeatedly in this show is fiduciary. How about either one of you or both of you tell us what you are, what you do, what it means to be a fiduciary?
That's a great question, Robert, and it gets thrown around a lot today. I mean, we've seen the Department of Labor get involved in the investment management business recently and talking about the fiduciary standard. But what is it? To your point, I've pulled the definition for you. So if we're looking at a fiduciary, it really is a person, agent, or entity in a position of authority whom the law obligates to act solely on the behalf of another in good faith. It's also the adherence to the highest standards of fiduciary care, act as a support in making and implementing discretionary decisions. And this is where you help your clients. Are they doing that? And maintain full and accurate records. We had a couple of jokes about this before air, that a lot of times people don't do that, and it's kind of surprising. But that's your job as a fiduciary, to maintain those. And you provide experience, objectivity, and also deliver confidence and trust. So that's what a fiduciary really is.
And in layman's terms, that would be a trustee of a trust, a guardian of somebody, someone who holds a power of attorney, perhaps, an executor of a will. All those types of roles are fiduciary roles.
Correct.
All right. With that basis, let's talk about what trends you're seeing in the world of the modern fiduciary.
Well, we like to call it the modern fiduciary, and it's because people have a vision of what the fiduciary was. If we go back to the 50s, 60s, and 70s, even the 80s, people had the idea of the bank, and there was the one bank in town, and mom and dad had a relationship with that bank. They might have built their wealth through that bank, and they decided, well, that's going to be the person that's going to be in charge of, my legacy, as Karen kind of described it. And there was a lot of negative connotations. There's a lot of cases that are very public, holding on to concentrations, not diversifying a portfolio, feeling that, I wasn't getting information, kind of going into a black box. So it came as a negative, and a lot of, big cases, which you all were involved in and helped clients address. And people started moving away from that. And we saw a trend going away from the larger banks just because of the inability for them to offer flexibility, transparency, and candidly be quick enough. And so we started to see individuals go into that role. We'll talk a little bit about that later. But then now we're starting to see a little bit of people getting away from that, because people are starting to realize, well, while that's flattering that mom and dad thought of me, or my business partner thinks of me that way, I've just talked to Adam and Robert, and they've said that I should be thinking about this, and this, and this, and I've got some exposure here, and do I want to open up myself for that? So we're seeing people saying, thanks, but no thanks, I need some help. So we're starting to see people kind of come back to the corporate fiduciary and saying, let's just make sure we pick the right one. Karen?
Yes, and another thing that I think has changed a lot over the past few decades especially is the evolution of how trust documents are written. If you look at the older trust documents, a lot of times they'll be, half a dozen pages or even a dozen pages.
Oh, they're definitely not that anymore.
Yeah, and now, exactly, they're, 50, 60, 70 pages, and they encompass just a much wider range of issues and also have a lot more flexibility. And so when you're looking at administering a trust or acting as a trustee, you really just have to understand that you've got to operate within that document. And so it's modern trust law has really brought in a lot of flexibility, and it creates a lot more for trustees to consider. While it creates options, it also makes it much more important to really understand what's in that document, because it's easy to miss things, but it's good to have the flexibility, so that the family's not just so locked into 6 or 12 pages, and the trust can actually grow and change with the family and the laws as necessary.
So tell our listeners some of the reasons you see, and there are certain themes as to why a trust would be appropriate for certain types of circumstances. I'm confident you see regularly different types of facts and circumstances where a trust would be appropriate, and circumstances where it may not be. There might be some other form, corporate form to follow, perhaps an LLC or a partnership or something.
I would say the most common thing that we see is asset protection, number one. People are looking to protect their assets. And then number two, quickly behind that, is going to be preparing people for the money in their family, whether it be a spouse that may not have the business acumen or have the exposure to the business. They want to make sure that that person is taken care of. The other thing that keeps people up at night is their children. We'll always second guess every single decision we make for our children, right?
Yeah, pretty much, yeah. I hope my kids are not listening.
Yeah, I'm not going to say that on air.
But, they worry. And, is this money that I've made, that I've worked really hard for, going to take away the drive for my kids? What can I do? And a trust can be a great vehicle to do that, and making sure that people are prepared for the money. And I'll let Karen kind of comment, because she's been involved in a lot of those.
I'm reminded, before you comment, Karen, I'm reminded of a Warren Buffett quote, which goes something like, I want to leave my kids enough money so they can do something, but not so much that they'll do nothing.
Right. Yeah. And if you look at others, there are other great quotes too. The Vanderbilts, I think one of the Vanderbilts has quoted saying that the money ruined them, and why did my parents leave me with all this money? So it's very important to leave it in a structure, and I think it also goes back to being proactive in involving your children. And you have to figure out what the right way to involve them is, and letting go of the purse strings with some of the money to let them explore, and then you can see how they can handle it. But it's really important to just make sure that you bring them in as appropriate. Now, if there's a good reason not to, then that's a different story. But if they're productive, functioning human beings, then it's, you know, it's,
and we all have those, right?
Right. So it's that, I think that's important. But for having a trust, and you don't want to think of it as just you know, putting a wall around the assets either. Especially with the modern documents, there's so many opportunities to bring family members in and involve them as appropriate. But it really does, as Tim says, go back to the asset protection. It protects assets from divorces. It protects assets from bankruptcy, creditors, judgment holders. So you really have to think of it in that term, and it's just a way to guard the family's wealth. It's also great for tax planning purposes. I was a tax attorney for about 10 years, so that's always a big one. And it's easy to get the tax planning in. And if you do it right and you structure it right and you have it in a jurisdiction, Georgia now, a trust can last for 360 years. So there are portions of that trust that can be sheltered from estate tax for 360 years now. So that's another important part. So the asset protection component as well.
And Karen, you've touched upon something that we often see as not happening and leading to the litigation that we're often representing folks in, and that is communication. Mm-hmm. You know, sort of the old school thought, I believe, was you don't talk with your kids about your money and your banker will deal with it, or whatever the case may be. And we see numerous situations where someone will pass away or something will happen and someone will come into significant wealth and have no idea what's coming, have no idea how to deal with it, manage it, or anything like that. So encouraging families multi-generationally to talk about their assets and their goals and their aspirations, I think, is very important.
Well, the bigger problem is when people think they're coming into a lot of wealth when somebody dies, and it turns out it's going to be tied up in trust for their step-parent or whatever for many years.
Right.
Which is why they need to know ahead of time that
Right.
that's what's happening.
Yeah.
Right.
So before we touch on, get back to the corporate fiduciaries, I mean, my experience, and we've been litigating now for probably close to 30 years in this field, my experience is that almost all of our cases involve litigation with an individual fiduciary, not a corporate fiduciary. We have very, very few cases that involve corporate fiduciaries. But that has always been the trend, because I think estate planners tend to, as a knee-jerk reaction to what their clients want, name the oldest son or the new wife or whoever as the fiduciary. And that leads to a lot of problems that corporate fiduciaries, I think, can solve. How do you get planners to recognize that that's a better solution, or how do you get your clients to realize that's a better solution than just naming a family member?
You know, that's such a good question, Adam, because you're exactly right. You know, we offer it as a service, as a resource. We're really good at it. We've been doing it the longest than anybody else in the country. But at the end of the day, people buy from people. People have personal relationships. And when it comes down to thinking about a legacy and who's going to be taking care of their kids, their business, their family, they're going to lean to a friend, somebody that they've known and that they trust. So it's always going to be an individual. What we will counsel them on is, have you talked to the individual? You know, do they know they're going to be asked to serve in this role? Do they understand that? We're happy to have a conversation with them so that they really understand that definition that we opened up the show with, that they're going to be held to that standard and that they're going to be liable to institute that standard in the relationship. And then when you start getting into, and I haven't, well, you know, that's probably a good time to engage them. And I think once they talk to the people they're thinking about and they realize that maybe that's too much to ask, and that's where, you know, you can bring in a co-trustee with the corporate. That's a great solution for your listeners because they're doing the heavy lifting on the corporate side. So to your point, they've got a lot of experience. They have deep pockets and resources. If they do make a mistake, they can fix it, right? You know, so you've got somebody to go back on, and those are important things. But at the end of the day, that individual is not carrying that burden all on their shoulders.
But they've also got the skills to account on a regular basis that everybody knows what's going on. There's complete transparency generally when a corporate fiduciary is involved.
That's right.
You
So
know,
that
tax returns get done on time.
That's right. And that can be a great solution to kind of marry the fact that you want to deal with somebody that you know and you like, but at the same time bring in somebody that can, you know, is equipped to do the heavy lifting, to your point.
And in these days when most families are probably blended families of some sort, where you've got a second or third spouse, you've got children perhaps from different marriages, if you're setting up trust to protect, you know, your surviving spouse, somebody else other than one of those other kids probably needs to be the go-between for managing the assets and making the kind of decisions that a trustee needs to make about distributions, right?
Well, it's interesting because, we'll share some stories as a conversation, but, I can think of one where, and it's really common, where it's multi-generational wealth. So if we're like, let's say 2 generations away from the wealth creator, they fall in line with that thinking, Adam. I mean, they totally get that. Even the kids are like, no, I don't want anybody serving except for corporate. I want somebody completely out of this.
I don't want my brother doing it. Right?
Exactly.
Right. Yeah.
But it's usually that multi-generational, person, because they're so trained to it, and they see, through other family branches where it didn't work. That's fine. Farm that out, and mom and dad don't have the pressure of picking one over the other. So
what problems do you see?
Well, Karen, I think
How much time do you have?
Yeah, right.
Karen's going to be finishing out the last half hour of the show.
I have a couple of kind of favorite examples. And one thing, if you start with what most middle-aged adults are, they have minor children.
She's looking around the table, and that's what she's saying. Right.
You have young children, and you have large life insurance policies and wealth that you would pass to your minor children in trust. And it's very important to decide, one, that who's going to be the guardian of the children, mm-hmm. and who's going to take care of the millions of dollars that would flow from this life insurance policy if, God forbid, something happens. And what we see is a lot of times people will name their siblings, and the siblings will be the guardian and the keeper of the money. And that has turned into disaster in as many cases as it's actually come to fruition in.
Yeah, we've seen plenty of those.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate because you have an uncle who's in charge of the money, and he has the best interests at heart, but he didn't have $10 million, and he doesn't know how to administer a trust, and now he's got $10 million through these kids, and I've seen it just be lost, because he made a bad investment with a buddy, and it's these people oftentimes do not have the experience, one, to administer a trust, nor do they have the acumen to manage the money that may flow for your minor children. So that's one kind of disaster, and so when a lot of us are thinking of who should be in charge of that, the minimal cost of a really good corporate trustee is really going to totally be beneficial and probably save the kids' assets and really just be a good thing.
Well, let's just get that on the table. Yeah. There is a cost to a corporate fiduciary, but there is a cost to an individual fiduciary as well. If you name your son or your wife or whatever to be the trustee, either the document provides what fee they'll get or the law provides it. So it's not like it's an either or.
Right.
Okay.
And my view of the cost is that rather than focusing directly on the cost, I think people ought to think of it as I do in terms of the fees I pay for money management. I think of it as an insurance premium. It's the premium I pay to avoid the type of risks you're talking about, that you've got a son or daughter who may not be able to manage the money correctly, or an uncle, or even a business associate. Lots of people we see name their CPA, an attorney who may not know anything about this. And I view those costs as something, candidly, no one likes to pay them. But if you think about it in terms of risk management, I think it makes eminent sense.
Absolutely. And there are many different cost structures for corporate trustees. And there are many different cost structures for individual trustees, as you mentioned, especially if you have a professional. So it's very important to really check out how those costs are going to play out. And, we at BNY Mellon does it very efficiently. It can be as low as 1/10 of a basis point, which is kind of de minimis when you look at all the things that are happening. But you can get into other situations where you have layered fees, or if you have independent individual trustees, then you're paying them sometimes up to 3%. And so there can be an enormous range of cost. So when you're considering a corporate trustee, that's something else that you need to factor in and make sure that it's understood. And especially if it's a complex relationship, you want to make sure that the beneficiaries of the trust understand it as well. You need to be as transparent as possible to make sure to avoid conflict.
Right. Communication and transparency.
Right.
You're listening to Wealth Matters, the radio show where we discuss the opportunities and challenges of preserving and managing your wealth. We're your hosts, Robert Port and Adam Gaslowitz from the fiduciary litigation firm of Gaslowitz Frankel. We're talking today with Karen Havey, family wealth strategist at BNY Mellon, and Tim Sheehan, senior director of business development at BNY Mellon. We're talking today about the benefits of using a corporate fiduciary. All right, so corporate fiduciaries. We have been encouraging them for as long as I can remember. In speeches I give, I've always talked about the benefits of that. One of the issues that comes up is how you parse fees with regard to corporate fiduciaries. There's been a trend lately in sort of segregating and breaking out the fees for different types of services. So it's not just a flat fee for one thing or another. How is that working today?
Well, I can't speak to other corporate fiduciaries,
Sure.
but what I can tell your listeners is make sure you understand what you're paying, right? I would tell my children growing up, everybody deserves to get paid. We just want to know how everybody's paid so we can make the decision, right? And I'm sure that's something you've, counseled clients over the years that probably couldn't see, where the fees were. And Karen's point about layer of fees, really understand what you're paying for. Because I agree with you, Robert. I'm glad to pay a fee as long as I'm getting that sense of protection, that assurance that this is something that's going to, take risk out of the road or soften the ride for me going forward. So from our perspective at BNY Mellon, we separate it, and it is a separate line item if we're serving as a corporate fiduciary. To Karen's point, over $10 million, it drops to 0.1%. So it is de minimis, and the client sees that, and they also see the amount of work that we're doing for that. And I would just, if you're going to be looking at a corporate fiduciary, cost efficiency is usually the reason you're bringing in a corporate fiduciary, because of the scale that they have, the experience they have. They can do that over a broader base of clients, so they can probably the best value choice for you, but make certain that they're breaking it out and you do understand it. And to your point, if they're working with an individual, make sure they understand under the state that they're in the maximum, because I believe in Georgia's, Karen, I think it's maybe up to 3%. You all would know.
It depends on whether you're a corporate or an individual.
That's right.
Yeah, with corporations, it's usually a published fee schedule.
Right.
And most of the banks have those. With individuals, it is a percentage of the trust each year. So it just depends.
So we just want to know as consumers, what that is, and we want to be able to see that clearly on the statements. So that would be the most important, because if you're going to hire a corporate, probably cost efficiency is one of the reasons you're moving towards that direction. The other tip that I would tell your listeners is ask, and I hear Karen mention this all the time in meetings with prospective families, where's the trust going to be administered? And getting back to your first question, Adam, what trends are we seeing? We're seeing trends with corporate that are centralizing and consolidating the services of trust. Now, is that a bad thing? No. I mean, it helps lower costs. But what's the client experience like? I don't know. We do it differently. It's handled locally through our regional offices. So Karen, in her role, is one of 12 wealth strategists who are attorneys around the country that serve and support our fiduciary relationship. So she's in on the front end. She's talking to you as you're considering, is a corporate trustee right for me? Is BNY Mellon corporate trustee right for me? So she's evaluating that relationship up front, and she's communicating to you how it would be administered, how you'd be supported, and you're meeting your team that is actually going to be your frontline point of contact. We're seeing in other corporates that that's going more to a centralized model, whether it be a call center support. Not saying that that's wrong, but at the same time, the client needs to be aware of that. So in addition to fees, is where is the trust going to be administered? Who's going to be my contact person?
And did you say that you thought a lot of corporate fiduciaries were getting out of this line of work?
Yes, that's what we are seeing. There's a trend for, especially in a brokerage model, for them to outsource it, or for it to be kind of in a separated from the investment management services. BNY Mellon is, we operate as a fiduciary for our clients, and there are other firms that do that as well. And our model is different. We're leaning in to the fiduciary services model, and we are trying to grow that business And in doing that, the first step is to make sure we have a really good, strong relationship with our clients and get to know the family so that we can then administer the trust through multiple generations as the wealth creator intended for that to be to be done. And there are models. There are models where you can have the corporate fiduciary that's managing the money, and that has the corporate trust department that kind of coincides with that, and everybody works together, and you're sitting next door to each other. That's more of a regional approach. Then you also have ones that will manage the money and have a more centralized trust department. So it's almost like can be kind of a separate function within the same organization. There's others that are completely out of the business, and they will have partners. That's where you start looking at two different layers of fees, because you've got your investment management fees, and then you've got another corporate trustee fee from a totally different company, and that can get more expensive. And so those are just the sorts of things that you have to take into consideration in determining what's the right corporate trustee for you. And many people have brokers that they have worked with for years, and they just want the family to continue with them, and so they need to look for the solution that's a corporate trustee that can pair well with that brokerage firm. Yeah. So it's just important to understand the relationships and the options.
Yeah, there are some companies like Cumberland Trust where all they do is the trust services, and
Sure.
So you can leave your assets with whatever asset manager you've had during your lifetime after your death, and they can be part of the solution along with a corporate fiduciary that just handles the trust services, makes the decisions about discretionary distributions, decides whether your kid gets a new car or not, all those things, or deals with kind of special needs issues and addiction issues that are coming up a lot in trust.
Right, and those types of companies can they may have more flexibility than a large corporate as well.
Let me ask a little bit about the assets that you manage, because generally when people talk about assets, and we've used the phrase money or assets, people are thinking stocks, bonds, liquid assets. Can you talk a little bit about whether and how you deal with unique or sort of non-diversified kind of assets? We see lots of trusts that end up owning businesses or parts of businesses.
Or owning nothing but land.
Right.
Thousands of acres
Thousands
of land
of acres
and
of
no
land.
liquidity at all.
Sure. So we encourage your listeners to give us a call, and let's see, how it's structured, what's ownership. We certainly have a closely held assets group that we partner with at BNY Mellon, inside of BNY Mellon. We certainly have a real estate group, so we can work on that. Again, since we administer it locally through Karen and her fiduciary team here in Atlanta, we want to make sure that it's something that we're going to be able to add value to. If it's completely 100% a business and there's somebody that's operating that business, we've been brought into those. We have to lean heavily on the people that are in the business, but maybe it's better solved in some other way.
But you don't want to be managing a business inside of a trust.
We would not. I mean, that comes, I think, to Robert mentioned earlier. What sorts of structures do you put in place within a trust? Mm-hmm. So is that an LLC or a partnership or corporation? When you have real estate, for instance, if it then, or if you have an operating business, of course, I think that when you have an operating business, that's when you really need to. You can have a corporate to help, especially on the administrative side of things, but of course, a corporate is probably never going to be the ideal, and I shouldn't probably say never, but it's probably not going to be the ideal thing for managing a family business. So you're going to have a business succession plan in place. Then if you want the business to continue on, you're going to have people in there to manage it.
This is one of the things that people ought to talk about in advance with whoever's going to be managing the estate, right?
Absolutely.
Because if there's a business in the estate, or if there's a lot of timberland that has to be managed or farmland, I mean, you need to know about it in advance, and some kind of plan needs to be encouraged before someone dies, right?
Absolutely.
Wow, that is such a great point, Adam. I cannot tell you how many people I will meet, and they will say, "Hey, I've named you in the documents."
I'm not going to tell you what's in the estate, but
you're
surprised.
You're 34. I guess in 50 years, somebody in my office will get a call. And that's such a good point, Adam, because tell people, if you're going to seek out a corporate fiduciary, listen, our costs and our fees don't start until we actually serve. So we're getting named every day, all day, in hundreds of documents we don't see until we're asked to serve. But you bring up a great point, Adam. Make sure you're communicating that to a potential corporate, because let's have that conversation with you. Well, this is a going business interest. Who are we going to be working with? I can think of one that Karen and I worked with. It was a going business, and we had to rely on key people, to operate this business. One, we were able to facilitate a sale. We were able to introduce banking capabilities to the family. We were able to introduce leverage and loans to bridge to get to a successful sale. Those are all things that, candidly, had we known in advance, and we were able to get there, but we were scrambling, right? Because, life happens. So by all means, Adam, exactly, if you're thinking about a corporate fiduciary, have a conversation. It doesn't cost you anything. Just, say,
This seems sort of elemental, but you can, and I know you don't like to do so, but even though you're named, you can decline the invitation.
That's a great
Right.
point,
And
Robert.
I'm not sure people realize that they're not just, sort of like a federal judge's appointment. It's
Right.
a lifetime appointment, whether you want it or not. You can decline if they've invited you to a party you don't care to participate in.
That is a great point for all the listeners to really make sure they understand, because they'll, people say, "Oh, well, I've named you in our documents." It's like, well, I don't know if we'll serve, but thanks.
You may not RSVP as they had intended.
How often do you get involved in the planning aspects with your clients? So that at some point you're going to be named as a corporate fiduciary, but at the moment you're simply the asset manager and financial advisor for the client. Do you work with clients about how to set up their estate, how to restructure things if they know that there are different milestones coming?
Day one, the bank in New York, Mellon name is, an iconic name in our industry, right? We've been around since the beginning, as we talked earlier. So people think of us as multi-generational wealth and Forbes 400 type of clients. And of course, those are our types of clients. But the absolute majority of our business is first generation wealth, and gives me a lot of personal joy because we get a chance to sit down with that wealth creator, and that's 99% of our business and our conversations, and they've done nothing because they have been heads down, they have worked in the business, and they've made the money, to your point. And then when you start talking to them, the first thing we do is, where's your estate plan at? And it may be nowhere, it may be nothing. And that's very rewarding. Karen's in on that meeting and has a conversation and starts mapping that out for them and really starts to kind of describe what they can do.
Right. As Tim mentioned, the Wealth Strategists are available for all of our clients. So that's another important thing for people to consider when they're choosing a wealth manager, because what are the resources? So as part of our client's relationship, they have access to a wealth strategist like me. And it's not a separate line of service, and we're not selling them a plan, but we really take a softer side approach with our clients and sit down and really kind of work through the family issues. We walk them through what they have. We make sure they understand it. A lot of people come in and they don't have any planning in place, so we'll help them, kind of figure out what they want, and then we pass it off to the attorneys. And pass it off to the attorneys to do the hard work. I don't do any drafting anymore, and I don't miss it either.
I hear that a lot.
Yeah,
I used to be an estate planning attorney 30 years ago, and I don't think I missed that either.
Yeah,
do you you must work with clients then on long range planning? It's like
yes. And we do. Also, one thing that I think is important is I had this question come up yesterday in a meeting with a client, but it was they're talking about choosing a corporate trustee, and should we let the corporate trustee look at the documents before they're finalized? And the answer is yes. And it's not because on our end we don't have anything that we have to have in the document.
But there are things you'd like to see in the document.
There may be. But I think just from the most fundamental perspective, it's make sure that, and this is a real problem that I see very consistently, make sure that the document says what it needs to say for your intent to be carried out. There's distribution language, and a lot of it's standard, and a corporate fiduciary has very, they have to govern. They govern within the document. They're limited to the document. There's no flexibility in that. And so you really need to understand how those terms are going to be administered by a corporate trustee. And we work very closely with our clients to make sure that their family is going to be taken care of the way that they want them to be taken care of. And sometimes that means going past just the typical health, maintenance, education, support standards in the document.
Which has a lot of flexibility in it, or certainly a lot of discretion in it.
It does. But it also, as a corporate, for instance, if that's what you're limited to, a lot of times you'll have that standard, and then you'll say, in accordance with their custom standard of living. So a corporate's going to, sit down at the beginning of the year and say, okay, well, let's make a budget, and what's your custom standard of living? And if they're accustomed to living at $100,000 a year, then the corporate's going to be hard-pressed to give them a $500,000 a year budget, because the corporate also has a fiduciary duty to remainder beneficiaries. And, so there's all kinds of standard lines that go into the trust. And sometimes if you have to take into account their other assets, then you've got to ask beneficiaries for tax returns. And beneficiaries get very angry about that. And especially if you've set up a trust for a spouse, a surviving spouse, then it's very important, if you're naming a corporate trustee, to go over the distribution terms of the document and to make sure that it says what it needs to say for your beneficiaries to get distributions in the manner in which you want them.
What you're really speaking to is eliminating any risk of ambiguity down the road.
Right.
Because all of the points you just raised are things that we often end up debating in our cases, which, if someone had looked at this ahead of time, the drafter and then the person who's going to implement it, and said, well, what does this mean? Maybe this could be clearer. It'll eliminate that type of ambiguity for the benefit of your client.
Yeah, or at least anybody can make an argument, right? So you can't always eliminate the ambiguity, but at least you can, try to start off in a good place.
Well,
right.
We also see a lot of situations where the standard of living that the family was dealing with was a much lower standard while the earner was alive, but they didn't like it. They were living way below their means because the patriarch was a cheapskate.
That's how he got all that money.
That's what got but after he's gone, people want to finally enjoy the fruits of someone else's life. Yeah, well, they want to enjoy it, and that also creates some conflicts. Like, we don't want to live that lifestyle anymore. We want to live a lifestyle that's more reflective of the wealth we have, not the saving environment we lived in.
Sure.
Is that something you try and talk about in advance? Do you talk about it with the settlor of these trusts and say, how generous do you want us to be going forward?
And but there's one, you built the $250,000 fountain at your home. That's going to have to be maintained. We get ice storms here, so we can't really make that on $60,000 a year out of the trust.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a hard. I mean, that's the difficult part of this. It's the personalities that come into play. And so a lot of the people that we work with that have that reaction, if they've been a business owner and they all of a sudden come into $50 or $100 million, and they've lived modestly up to that point, it takes a long time for them to become comfortable with the wealth. And we have many clients in this area where we work with them as their wealth grows or when they've had a big liquidity event, and it takes a long time for them to get used to it. So you kind of introduce the concepts, slowly, and the more comfortable they become with the wealth, then, maybe the more lenient they would want their trust to be. In the situation that you mentioned specifically with a patriarch that's, doesn't like to spend money, is very frugal and wants everything locked up, I think that creates one of the most difficult and probably a lot of business for you all, because it really can, especially, one of the worst situations I saw was the patriarch just like that left a very small publicly traded business and other privately held businesses to his 3 kids. And it was a disaster. It was tied up in these trusts that made no sense, and the kids had, different vote. They were arguing about who had voting rights, and I mean, there were lawsuits in at least 3 states. And
a lawyer's dream.
Yeah,
music to our ears.
Happy holidays.
Yeah, but you talk about.
But these are all problems that are avoidable if there's enough discussion going into this.
Right.
I don't know if they're completely avoidable, but when I hear stories like that, what I think of is, and this is actually what interests me about this practice and what you do, is I'm always interested in how people deal with money, how they think about money, what they understand it can accomplish, it do for them or not do for them, whether they want to be philanthropic and things like that. And the tensions that Adam's questions suggested reveal that completely, because you have someone who's self-made, very frugal, and they may have, their next generations who are just spendthrifts. And it reminds me of that phrase, what is it, shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in
3 generations.
3 generations. Right. And maybe for our listeners, explain what that means.
And I think it's in 8 different languages.
Yeah, I think
so
rice paddy to rice paddy.
Right, exactly. But it really does mean that the wealth creator makes it, and they've worked hard, they've lived frugally, they haven't spent it, and they've had a dream for their next generation, and that next generation would be going to college and getting a PhD and being something that they never had the opportunity or felt like they had to do, and so they had the resources to be able to do that. But there's no education, there's no communication, which both Adam and Robert have talked to us about, how the importance of that with our families. And then the 3rd generation comes, and there's certainly a lot of wealth at that point, but there's no work ethic. There's no lead by example. There's been no communication. There's been no, this is what we do. This
and
is
no training on how to preserve the wealth. So by the 3rd generation, it's generally
gone. And we get asked all the time, how much should I tell the kids about? And the answer is, how much have you prepared them for?
That's a big problem. All right, so as we wind down the show, unless you've got something,
let's see where you're going to go with this.
I was just going to ask for maybe a success story or two from you guys about
you read my mind.
Problems that came through the door that you magically solved.
Well, I think
maybe not magically,
but Karen can add to this. But one that we feel like we can add a tremendous amount of value is, we're kind of a resource for you. We're there working for you as your family, helping you kind of manage your entire balance sheet, even things that we don't manage directly, making sure that you achieve your objectives, managing things, that balance sheet, to get the best possible outcome that you can. And maybe a corporate trustee is not right now, but it's nice to know that resource is there for you. Or maybe it's just a training, and maybe it's taking an individual like a family member, a child, and you want to name them as a trustee, and then being able to sit side by side with them and tell them what their roles and responsibilities are going to be. That's really kind of cool. We're not even serving in that role, but we're training, and we're showing them what they have to do. And I think Karen will talk a little bit about writing out a trust abstract. Trust, I'm not an attorney. I'm with 3 attorneys this morning on this show, and it's like Chinese. These things are really, really big, and we rely on you to tell us what's in them. But sometimes just having somebody like a corporate that maybe not even serving and kind of describe the trust abstract.
Right. And, we have so many people that walk in the door, and they have so much anxiety about their wealth and about how it's going to pass to the children and who's going to take care of it. And really just sitting with clients and providing the options and ensuring them that it will be okay. And it's a combination of getting a document in place or documents in place that they're comfortable with, and making sure that the appropriate people are named. And if they want a corporate trustee, or we think it's right, then we will walk through the process with them, walk through the document, and make sure that it's set up correctly. And we always encourage people to have a way to remove a corporate trustee in their documents.
Point.
You don't want to. We wouldn't want to be locked into a relationship. We don't want the beneficiaries to be locked into a relationship that they're not comfortable with. So it's really getting the people comfortable, and then also helping them to bring the family in as appropriate. And even starting as, we have children as young as 13 come into the office for a half day, kind of financial camp, and we talk about stocks and bonds and bank accounts and philanthropy, and it's really fun, but it's just introducing concepts.
You should have that in all middle schools.
Right. Yeah.
Absolutely.
But those are the success stories, because I see the clients, they come in and they really are anxious, and it takes a long time. I mean, especially for the big projects, it's a good year that we really work through the progression of it. But at the end of it, they have relief, and I think that happens numerous times a year for us. We're lucky; we have great clients that we work with, and it's really good at the end of the year of planning to see them with some relief.
All right, so before we close, why don't I get each of you to tell our listeners how they could contact you, email addresses, website, whatever contact information you find appropriate.
If you can't find me, I'm not doing my job, but I'm at timothy.sheehan@bnymelon.com. I'm on Instagram at Timothy_Sheehan. And I don't do Twitter, but we do have a Twitter account. It's TES_Roman numeral 7. That's V11. And my phone number is 404-664-8182.
Karen?
Yes, it's Karen.Havey@BNYMelon.com, and my phone number is 678-538-2061.
Okay.
Thank you. As we are wrapping up our show, I want to thank everyone for listening to Wealth Matters, where we discuss the opportunities and challenges of preserving and managing wealth. For more information about Gaslowitz Frankel, please go to our website at gaslowitzfrankel.com. And remember to follow us on Twitter at Estate Dispute and use our show's hashtag Wealth Matters. Our guests today were Karen Havey, Family Wealth Strategist, BNY Mellon, and Tim Sheehan, Senior Director of Business Development, BNY Mellon. Please join us every fourth Wednesday of the month at 8:30 a.m. here at Wealth Matters on Business Radio X.